Maya Hu-Chan, welcome to The Engaging Leader.
Good morning.
Maya, what do you mean by face?
Jesse, face is a universal concept and beyond its origins of Asia. And so it permeates almost at all levels of social and business interactions. So when you hear somebody say something like, well, it's not about the money, it usually has something to do with face. So the definition of face is that it represents your self-esteem, self-worth, reputation, your status, dignity, and pride. And so it's very, very important for a person to feel like they have the face that they deserve, and also rent face to people to show respect and to show appreciation. So, face, this concept of face is thousands of years old, but it's new again at our time right now. And face enables us to make connections with people and to break down barriers and to build some trust and authentic relationship with people we work with and with people that in our community. So it really speaks to a deeper need for connection, acceptance, and also the way that we grant dignity and respect to one another.
You mentioned Asia, and I know you grew up in Taiwan, and you've been
Yes.
in the United States since the 1980s. Apparently, it's a concept that translates to the U.S. It's probably a global issue these days.
Absolutely. I have, since I grew up in Taiwan, that I, of course, was emerged with all the Asian culture. And since I came to the US, I've worked with global leaders around the world for 20 plus years. And, over the years that I work when I coach leaders, that I often find that I share with them this concept of face. And is so essential to their leadership, but often it's counterintuitive, and people don't realize how important it is until they face some challenging situations, and then they look deeper, they look closer, and then the leaders discover that this is so essential, is to be able to understand how to protect face, how to honor face, and also how to avoid causing someone to lose face. So then they can really truly build that empathetic and authentic relationship with people.
Does it come more intuitively in certain Asian cultures?
When you grow up, when I grow up in Asian culture, that this is something that we practice every day, right? And then it's like fish in the water, that you don't realize that this is something that seems to be everywhere. And that's how people live, how they interact with each other, and then how they build relationships. So, I think this is really permeates in many in everyday lives. And it's not any particular culture, but I think in the Asia Pacific region, that people are particularly mindful and about this concept of face. And you notice that actually people may or may not say this word face in other cultures. But as I work around the globe with global leaders, I've noticed that, when it comes down to building relationship and working with people and motivating teams, and you have to really hone into making that connection and think about, how do I show up as a leader, and how do I communicate, and also how do I help people protect face, so that people feel safe, and then they feel that they can be themselves, and then they will be able to do their best work day in and day out. So that's why I realized that I've discovered and learned over the years that this is not just the Asian concept. This really is universal.
Yeah, and you mentioned it comes up a lot in your work as an executive coach with leaders around the world. Why is face so important when in the context of leading a team?
That's a great question. In today's the leaders that we operate in a very complex and diverse business environment. So we have to work with people not only across geography and time zones, but also we have to work with people with diverse backgrounds, different generations, different cultures, and different genders, and of all the human differences. So as a leader, that we must be able to have that awareness, to tune into those human differences, and in order to build some authentic relationships. Now, the leaders must be able to move in many circles and think in different styles, and then be able to adapt to those differences. So some of the most common challenges that leaders face is to engage and motivate their teams. And so when team members, very often the leaders share with me that they're experiencing burnout or lack of motivation, or they're disengaged, or they're simply frustrated about something. And when you look deeper and dig deeper, and what many leaders didn't expect is that those issues often have to do with face. And then they may not actually say things like, oh, I lost face in those situations. A lot of times you will hear people say something like, my boss didn't appreciate my work, or people don't take my work seriously. I'm not being heard, or I don't feel like I fit in. Or I've been passed over for promotions, even though I've been working so hard. You've heard a lot of those kind of expressions, and then people either check out or they leave. So then leaders need to pay attention to those signals and engage their people. When you think about the way that we operate, I've noticed that, and I've learned leaders very often, they actually operate on autopilot. What I mean by that is that, when we work with people with diverse backgrounds, different background from us, that whether they're virtual, like the way we are right now, right? Every day we communicate with people using technologies, or we're even with people who sit right next to us, that we can't assume everybody's the same as us, okay? And then, but a lot of times that we're so busy that we tend to operate like autopilot. And so we say things, we operate, we make assumptions based on our own cultural background and also our own frame of reference. And this could be dangerous. Imagine that, if you are driving in a foreign country, right? And we don't really know where we're going. Sometimes we don't really know the signs. We're not familiar with surroundings. And sometimes even we're driving on the wrong side or the opposite side of the road, right? and if we are not paying attention, if we're on the autopilot, what happens? We can get lost, or worse, we can crash and burn. So now this is something that sometimes leaders don't think about, is that when we work with people who are different from us, that the differences may not be that obvious, but if we're not paying attention, we continue to operate in our autopilot, that we can actually crash and burn. So it's almost like learning how to drive when we face different audience, different team members, and when we work with people with different backgrounds.
What do you mean by honoring face, losing face, and saving face?
So there are three key concepts of this, okay? The first concept is honoring face. The second one is losing face, which we want to avoid. And the third concept is saving face. So now I'm going to step back and then think about face as a type of social currency. Okay? And imagine how we build a supply of face with someone or with people, and then by continuously making deposit into the bank account of face. And you can think of it as continue to build trust, credibility, and relationships. Okay, so now honoring face is the first concept. It's about making actual deposit of face by taking actions to show respect, to show admiration, and also dignity to one or more people. Okay, and so there are many different ways that we can do that to honor someone's face. You can ask somebody for input, listen to them. Those are simple ways to honor face, right? To give people positive recognition, and then to empathize with them, or put yourself in their position to understand their challenges, or give their voice equal time and weight, so that you give people equal time and weight when in a group setting, to make sure that they are being heard and they feel valued and appreciated. And then, so when we make those deposits every day, right, at different situations and scenarios, and when we need to make a withdrawal someday, we are careful not to make someone losing face. And then we provide feedback in a way that save face and preserve dignity. And if we mistakenly cause them to lose face, and the relationship can still be saved if there are enough deposits to cover the withdrawal.
Maya, can you give us a real life example about what that looks like?
Absolutely. So a client of mine shared a story with me, and that's happening with a team member of his that is from a different cultural background. And this team leader sent an email to his team member and asking him to accomplish certain tasks by certain date. And he received an email reply from this team member. And first of all, this team member is from a different cultural background. Also, English is not his native language. So the reply email has only 2 words: no way. So the leader was, not pleasantly surprised. He was actually quite upset when he got this email. And so immediately what went through his mind was that, this is so rude. Well, I'm your boss. I'd ask you to do something. How can you say no way and without any explanation? And that is just unacceptable. So he immediately started typing a very angry email reply back to that person. But then as he was typing, he sit back and kind of read his email again. And then he realized that, wait a minute. I have worked with this person for about a year, and he has always been responsive, courteous, hardworking, and respectful. So why would he write an email saying no way to me? It must be a good reason. And so instead of sending this angry email, he decided to pick up a phone and talk to this person. So then he picked up a phone and asked, I'm just wondering about this email reply about this task I asked you to do. Why did you say no way? And this team member responded by saying that, the deadline that you gave me, that week I have 2 other deadlines. And so it's very difficult for me to actually accomplish all of them. So, and then he went on and explained 2 other tasks that he had to do that same week. And then, so he apologized, and then so the leader said, okay, no problem. We can modify the deadline. But why did you say no way? And that seemed really, impolite. And then this person say, you know what? I'm watching all the American movies and TV, and they use this way, no way, all the time. And then also, I wanted to learn how to be more direct in my communication. So I thought I want to talk like Americans. That's why I used the word no way. And he had no idea that this was offensive. So being a leader, that sometimes we don't double check, and then if he continued to operate on autopilot, he would have sent this angry email over to this team member and caused the other person to lose face and embarrassed and feel terrible about it. This may actually damage the relationship. Instead, he stepped back and say, wait a minute, I got to find out more about what's really going on. And then so he got off the autopilot and figured out what really is happening. So I have, in my years of experience of working with global leaders, and I have lots of examples in my book, Saving Face. And this is something that we can learn. Sometimes we can cause somebody to lose face, we don't even know it. And then so don't run on your autopilot. Stop, pause, and think about it before you act.
Yeah, as I was listening to that story, I was imagining myself in the shoes of the employee. If I were if I were an expat working in a different uh, country or culture, but also even just in my day-to-day work, sometimes you get into situations where you're trying to, maybe I'm talking with someone who's just from a very different background. And so I'm trying to understand them, and maybe there's something I thought we had in common, and I'll use a phrase or something because I think it makes us relate better, and it just doesn't come off well. And they're hearing it through a different set of lenses. Okay, just
Yes.
mix my metaphors there, but they're getting it. It's getting muffled somehow, and it's just so helpful when we can not assume, or at least assume the best intent, and maybe just pick up the phone and ask them about it instead of just jumping to a conclusion. Well, this person's insensitive or a jerk.
Yes, yes. And we all are guilty of sometimes overusing email because it's so easy and quick, right? But a lot of times that miscommunication, misunderstanding happen because email it's a faceless medium that people can misread it, and then that it can come across as impolite or even rude. And so to save time, and also to make sure that we don't create any kind of unnecessary conflict, pick up the phone and or text somebody, and then to connect in person. That often can help you eliminate a lot of those potential conflict or headache.
I know we were planning on talking about psychological safety, but I wonder if we could save that for the follow-up conversation. I think that has some aspects that go along with feedback. And I wonder if this might be a good time to ask you about cultural agility. How does cultural agility affect face?
Yes, so that's a great question, Jesse. That cultural agility is something that many leaders have to work with, and in order to work effectively across cultures. And then when we think about culture, it's not just national culture, like US versus Japan versus Germany. It goes beyond that. It can be a generational culture. When we work with people from different generations, when we work with people that actually live in different part of the country, that they may have a different regional culture. So how can leader be adaptable and flexible when we work with people, and then to avoid some of the unnecessary misunderstanding, is that to actually think about what are some of the things that we do that we need to continue to be mindful about, and not to make assumptions or draw conclusion too quickly, right? And then so in my book, I talk about this AAA model that can actually help us avoid some of those mistakes. So the AAA stand for, number one is be aware. Be aware of your own assumptions, aware of your own beliefs, and also be aware of your own bias, because nobody's bias free. So have that self-awareness. And I often like to use the metaphor, it's called the human antenna, right? So imagine that in the old days, we have those old-fashioned radio stations, radios, and then when we pull the antenna up, then we can hear things more clearly. But when we don't have an antenna up, then sometimes a lot of statics. So if we are, we can always raise our human antenna to be aware of the signals that we're sending out, and also to be aware of how other people are feeling. and reacting and their frame of reference and also their situations. And that's the first step, is to have that awareness. And the second step, the second A, is acquire. And so to acquire information from the other person about what's really happening, be curious and ask questions and try to understand the situation they're facing. And so acquire is really about seek to understand and being empathetic. And then the third A is adapt. So then once you have those information and then you understand what's happening from their point of view, then you can adapt your behavior, your actions to solve the problem or to resolve the situation. So that's the AAA model. It's very simple, but it's not necessarily easy to do. Is that aware, acquire, and adapt. One of the common things that many of the leaders that I work with tend to run into is that they don't realize that something that can be completely acceptable in your cultural or your community, the way that you're used to, but then can be completely acceptable in the way that your frame of reference, but can be offensive in another setting, and vice versa. So as simple as using slangs and idioms, right? Clients have told me things like they would use a lot of those things in their video or in the conference calls. One time a client said something about, oh, you know what, Jeff is not available, he's tied up right now. And people from the other end were surprised and scratching their head and said, he's tied up right now? What happened to him? Right? What's going on? Or we say things like, oh, it's a piece of cake, or we're all on the same boat. Or a lot of sports related phrases like let's touch base, or let's get the ball rolling, or catch 22. Those are simply not universal expressions. So we do have to be careful and be aware of how we communicate, how we come across. And recently, a client of mine, I was working with the executive team, and it's a multicultural group. And they all came from different backgrounds now in different countries. One of the team members made a comment about the other leader of saying that, oh, you know what, you're old, you're fat. And everybody was horrified by that comment. And then so they thought, well, how can you be so insensitive of saying something like this? But they're not knowing that this person is actually from Asia and making the comment that they acquire where she coming from. And then one person actually was curious about asking her, why did you make those comments? Isn't this offensive? And then she said, no, in Asian culture, that when we comment on somebody being old, has a lot to do with that, because we believe that seniority, and so the older person usually is being, we grant them respect. So then they're more wise. So then when we say somebody is old, it's actually a compliment. And then when we comment on somebody being gaining some weight, it's usually it's to compliment them for, like, they look healthy and they look well, because that's how the culture works. And so once they acquire the story behind her comment, and everybody just had a good laugh. Mm-hmm. And then they share with her that this is actually not how Western cultural perceive or interpret those comments. And then so she also learned a big lesson about, oh, those can really offend somebody if I'm not careful. So those kind of conversation is really helpful for people to work together and so that goes back to cultural agility, is that you don't want to cause somebody to lose face by unintentionally saying or doing something that you with the best intention. So it's always good to double check, to acquire information and adapt your behaviors.
That first topic, aware, how do you help leaders develop that awareness? Are there any resources that you point someone to become, have greater awareness of their biases?
Absolutely. There are, many ways that we can actually raise that awareness. I think one of the good way is to simply asking for feedback, and ask your colleagues, your friends, and the people you work with that to provide you with some feedback to help you understand how you're being perceived. And that way, it's like holding a mirror in front of you, and also you'll be able to identify some of the blind spots that you may have. And you may have the best intention, but you can cause somebody to lose face or damage the relationship. You don't even know it. So asking for feedback is very, very helpful, and it's an easy way to actually get that information quickly. And there are a lot of assessment tools that we use for my cultural training or leadership development that can really help you know yourself and then raise that self-awareness. Recently, I would recommend assessment tools such as a global competency inventory, or some other tools that are out there that many of them are very effective.
This is probably a good time to just ask you to tell us, how can listeners find out more about you and your work, and learn about some of those assessment tools that you offer?
Absolutely. So you can go to my website, www.mayahuchan.com. It's my name, MAYAHUCHAN.com. And it has lots of information in the website, articles and assessment tools or recommendations, and also the services that I provide for clients, particularly has to do with leadership development, executive coaching, and speaking.